name is Andrew Colligan, and I am the archivist here at the Missouri Botanical Garden. Today I'm going to be your online guide to briefly introduce you to the garden's non-living collections. By that I mean our library collection and our herbarium collection. I will also be touching upon the story of Dr. George Engelmann, the person we think of as the godfather of these historic collections. Today we're in the rare book room of the garden's Peter H. Raven Library. Out here on the table we have items that pertain to the history of Dr. George Engelmann, and also books that are by the authors that were included in a list that Shaw sent to Engelmann when Engelmann traveled Europe in 1857 and 58. It would be on this trip that Engelmann would purchase the first library of books for the garden's collection, and also on this trip Engelmann would purchase the first herbarium specimens that would form the nucleus for the garden's herbarium collection. That collection that Engelmann purchased was that of Jacob Bernhardi. That collection numbered around 60,000 botanical specimens, and today the garden houses a collection of over 7 million. Some of the first items we'll be looking at today are a scrapbook of Dr. George Engelmann and a daguerreotype. The scrapbook was compiled by Engelmann's son, Dr. George Julius Engelmann, who became a well-known doctor in his own right. The scrapbook runs the gamut of Engelmann's life, documenting his early days in Germany, his scientific studies in school, and also documents his travels to America, including the ship that he sailed on. The scrapbook continues on through the rest of Engelmann's life and covers the time when he became a well-known practicing physician in St. Louis, and also covers the period when he became Shaw's scientific advisor. Here we see a self-portrait sketched by Engelmann himself. This comes from the scrapbook and is the earliest existing image of Engelmann, dating back to 1830. George Engelmann was born February 2, 1809, the oldest of 13 children, in what is today modern-day Frankfurt, Germany. His father, Julius Bernhard Engelmann, operated a school for young women in Frankfurt, which was a rarity at the time. Engelmann received his early education in Frankfurt, and according to himself, became interested in plants at the age of 15. He had a natural affinity, and devoted much of his time, in addition to study of plants, to history, modern languages, and drawing. Engelmann received a scholarship in 1827, and he began to study the sciences at the University of Heidelberg. The following year, Engelmann's studies would be interrupted after joining a student protest and political demonstration. Afterwards, he left Heidelberg and entered the University of Berlin, and after 2 years, in 1831, he received the degree of M.D. from the University of Wurzburg. Here we see more drawings by Engelmann contained within his scrapbook. Contained within the Engelmann scrapbook is a copy of his 1831 dissertation, entitled Enthalaceae prodromus. The dissertation was focused mainly on plant morphology and was published in 1832. Seen here are botanical illustrations drawn by Engelmann himself for his 1831 dissertation. After graduation, Engelmann spent part of 1832 in Paris, seeking out and philosophizing with other like-minded individuals on the fledgling field of botany. After recognizing limited opportunities for an individual such as himself in Europe, both financially and scientifically, Engelmann set his sights on America, and in late 1832 accepted an offer from his uncle to become an agent for the purchase of land in the United States. In September of 1832, Engelmann sailed from Bremen for Baltimore, Maryland, and then from there on to St. Louis, Missouri. He settled with relatives and the lawyer Gustav Kerner on a farm in St. Clair County, Illinois, near Belleville for the next 3 years. Over the next 3 years, Engelmann took horseback journeys to the states of Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas, doing mineralogical and geological work, but also botanizing along the way. These trips often proved difficult, and Engelmann suffered sickness and hardship during these journeys. Beginning in 1835, Engelmann began his medical practice in St. Louis and was immediately successful. Despite having a busy medical practice, Engelmann continued on with his scientific studies and observations. Beginning in 1836, Engelmann began doing meteorological studies of the St. Louis area, a practice he would continue to do until his death in 1884. He also launched the German-language newspaper Das Westland and began studying plant species that had been overlooked by other botanists. The daguerreotype was taken around 1852 and features the earliest image we have of Dr. George Engelmann, his son George Julius, and it is the only existing image of his wife, Dorothea. After meeting Asa Gray in 1840 upon his return visit from Europe with his fiancée, Engelmann began operating as the key contact in the city of St. Louis for other botanists who were out collecting plants in the West. Some of these botanists were either operating on their own funds or sometimes as members of government expeditions. Engelmann's service resulted in the flow of new information for the study of botany to those on the East Coast. He encouraged and supported, among others, Ferdinand Lindheimer in Texas, August Fendler in New Mexico and Central America, and John C. Fremont in the West. Considered the preeminent American botanist of the 19th century, Asa Gray became the professor of botany at Harvard University in 1842 and built an extensive network of specimen collectors. Gray was instrumental in bringing together the taxonomic knowledge of the plants of North America. A prolific writer, many of his works on botany, the most popular being his Manual of the Botany of the Northern United States from New England to Wisconsin and south to Ohio and Pennsylvania inclusive, is simply known today as Gray's Manual. Engelmann and Gray would forge a lifelong friendship, which would last until Engelmann's death in 1884. Their friendship was based on a mutual respect and love for the study of plants. Prior to meeting Henry Shaw, Engelmann was very active in the St. Louis region both medically and scientifically. He was a founding member of the St. Louis Medical Society in 1836, helped create and establish the Western Academy of Natural Sciences in 1837, and was a founding member in 1856 of the Academy of Science, St. Louis. Born in Sheffield, England in 1800, Henry Shaw first came to North America in 1818 along with his father. Determined to set off and chart a course on his own, Henry Shaw traveled to the interior of North America and eventually settled in St. Louis, first traveling here, coming up the Mississippi River in 1819. Upon settling down in St. Louis, Shaw in the early 1820s established a general store down near the Mississippi riverfront. This would prove very lucrative for Henry Shaw, and over the following years, with each passing year, his business grew more and more successful. By 1839, Shaw had amassed a fortune of $250,000 running his general store and decided to retire. Over the course of the next 10 years, Shaw would take 3 trips abroad, back then considered and called the Grand Tour. This would have been a tour of Europe and the Mediterranean. During these trips, Shaw would have seen some of the finest private and public gardens on display in all of Europe. He also visited botanical gardens and public parks. It would be in his last trip abroad in 1851 when he went and visited the Great Exposition of 1851 in England. It would be on this final trip abroad, while walking the grounds of Chatsworth, one of the finest estates in all of Europe, that Shaw said the idea came to him that why couldn't he create a botanical garden on a smaller scale in his adopted home of St. Louis. Upon his return, Shaw began to develop the grounds around his country estate, which would become known as Tower Grove. Tower Grove was property that Shaw originally purchased in 1842, which was west of the city boundary. This property would eventually become the grounds for the Missouri Botanical Garden and also Shaw's second gift to the city of St. Louis, Tower Grove Park. As Shaw came closer to realizing his idea of establishing a botanical garden in St. Louis, he decided to reach out to William Jackson Hooker, the preeminent botanist and first director of Kew Gardens outside of London. While Shaw was dedicated to establishing his botanical garden as a fine horticultural display garden, he also wanted to inquire about what it would entail to create a botanical garden that would also support the study of botanical science. And to that, Hooker replied that Shaw would need a library and a herbarium, and he would also need a museum to house these. Hooker also advised Shaw that a gentleman, literally located in his own backyard, would be the finest person to select for him to help realize his dream of creating a garden for botanical research. Of course, that person would be none other than Dr. George Engelmann. Prior to being introduced, Engelmann was aware of Shaw's efforts on the outskirts of town. In April 1856, Engelmann wrote to Asa Gray that we have a very rich Englishman here, Shaw, an old resident and bachelor who concluded to devote his time and fortune to the founding of a botanical garden and collection. Kew in miniature, I suppose. Soon after, the two would be introduced and form a lifelong friendship, and soon Engelmann would fulfill his role as the guiding hand, assisting Henry Shaw in establishing the Missouri Botanical Garden not only as one of the finest horticultural displays, but also as one of the finest botanical science institutions. Engelmann was enthusiastic about Shaw's idea of establishing a botanical garden in St. Louis, and soon began acting as his agent, in particular when he traveled to Europe between 1857 and 1858. It would be on this trip that Engelmann would purchase the first library books and the first herbarium specimens for the garden. Seen here is correspondence between Shaw and Engelmann, including a list of authors that Shaw wanted Engelmann to consider purchasing. Seen here is Henry Shaw's museum that he had constructed between 1859 and 1860 at a cost of $25,000. It would be in this building that the original herbarium and library collection would be housed. This building sat dormant for many years unused and was recently renovated and reopened in 2018. During the demolition process, a drop ceiling was removed from a first floor room on the south end of the building. Hidden behind this drop ceiling were barrel vaults, revealing undocumented portraits of botanists dating back to Shaw's time. This room was the original location for the garden's library. And in this instance, Shaw was paying tribute to where tribute was due. One portrait was of Dr. George Engelmann, the other was of Carl Linnaeus, and to the right, Dr. Asa Gray. Upon completion of the project, Shaw's museum is known today as the Stephen and Peter Sachs Museum, and is the location on garden grounds for the garden's rotating exhibits. Here we see a few images of the garden as it would appear during Shaw's lifetime. Seen here on display is the Garden Library's 1735 copy of Systema Naturae by Carl Linnaeus. The Swedish scientist Carl Linnaeus was an organizer and deviser of systems. His binomial system of plant and animal taxonomy is still in use today. This is an early work in which he first describes his new arrangement of the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms. The plants are arranged according to sexual morphology, an approach that is no longer in use. Here we have Novi Hollandia Plantarum Specimen by Jacques-Julien Houteau de Billardière, 1804 to 1806. This is the first general description of Australian plants to be published in Europe. La Billardière traveled to Oceania in 1791 as part of a large French expedition and botanized extensively. These important materials found themselves in a war zone soon after they were collected, when the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars between France and Great Britain began in 1792. The British seized Billardière's collections before they could return to France, but English botanist Joseph Banks eventually helped the French botanist after he made several pleas to British authorities for restitution. After Banks' intervention, the plant specimens were sent to France, where they were published. Here we have Dealing with the Trees and Shrubs That Are Grown in France in the Open Ground by Duhamel. Duhamel was a scientific polymath who concentrated his efforts on chemistry and botany. His interest in woody plants was related to his job of superintending the supply of timber for building French ships of war. This volume is a later edition of a work first printed in 1755. This later edition is remarkable for containing illustrations by the renowned botanical artist Rudete. This herbarium specimen was part of the Bernhardi purchase. It is also the oldest plant specimen in the garden's collection. The sheet holds two different plants. The oldest is an Arctic violet collected in 1692, and the other is an anemone collected a few years later. While Engelman was assisting Shaw in establishing the Missouri Botanical Garden and getting its first library of books and herbarium specimens, he also continued on doing his own botanical studies. In 1859, Engelman published Cactaceae of the Boundary, which was a study of cactus on the border of the United States and Mexico. Seen here are plates from this work drawn by Paulus Roeder. This is the type specimen of Opuntia strigil, or prickly pear. This material was collected as part of the Border Survey. It was described by George Engelmann in the Proceedings of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Volume 3, 1856. It is illustrated in the publication describing the cacti encountered in the Border Survey. Here first is a letter from Linheimer to Engelmann about how he just encountered a new variety of dodder. In the middle is a specimen collected by Linheimer and used as the type specimen for the variety. And finally, to the right, is the journal in which the variety was officially described by Engelmann. The journal in question is the Boston Journal of Natural History. The history of the principal varieties and species of grapes that originated in America and are resistant to phylloxera. This book was a gift to Engelmann from the author, Day. Engelmann began studying grapes in the 1850s, and in 1861 published a pioneering paper examining plant diseases focusing on the grape. Here we see a grape plant specimen created by Dr. George Engelmann himself in 1875. This specimen highlights a phylloxera infestation, and the galls can clearly be seen on the leaves. Dr. George Engelmann worked closely with Isidore Bush, owner of the largest St. Louis nursery at the time, to publish the Illustrated Descriptive Catalog of American Grapevines in 1875. The catalog was later translated to French and became the definitive work delineating North American vitis species. Starting in the 1870s, an insect named phylloxera began destroying the European wine industry. Using Engelmann's herbarium specimens, Engelmann and Missouri entomologist Charles V. Riley determined that the phylloxera insect was native to North America, and that American grape species were resistant to the pest. Engelmann, along with Bush and two other Missouri horticulturists, George Hussman and Herman Jaeger, helped develop and organize the shipment of millions of phylloxera-resistant American grapevines to France, where they were used as hardy rootstocks to which European vines were grafted. The defeat of the phylloxera problem was the first triumph of modern biology over an immense economic disaster, and Missouri scientists Engelmann, Riley, Bush, Hussman, and Jaeger played a key role in the solution. As phylloxera has become pandemic, grapes all over the viticultural world are now grafted onto the resistant rootstock, all of which have North American origins. Here we have one of the garden's copies of the Illustrated Descriptive Catalog of American Grapevines, a Grape Grower's Manual, 1883, aka the Bushberg Catalog. It includes a treatment of grape. Inside the book, on the acknowledgement page, is a section dedicated to Dr. George Engelmann's efforts. Another area of expertise of Dr. George Engelmann was his knowledge and study of conifers. Here we see the revision of the genus Pinus by Dr. George Engelmann, 1880. The conifers were one of a number of plant families that interested Engelmann. A conifer was even named after him. Many who don't know of his work in Missouri as a botanist will recognize the name of the Engelman spruce. Here is a copy from the garden's library collection, Engelman Spruce in the Rocky Mountains by Elmer Reed Hodson, 1910. Here we see examples of Engelman spruce growing in the wild. In honor of Engelman's work describing the pine trees of the region, today he is honored with a mountain named after him, Engelman Peak, located in Colorado. Engelman's expertise and connection in the botanical world gave the Missouri Botanical Garden a prestige that it would not have otherwise had at its inception. Engelman was named a founding member of the National Academy of Sciences in 1863, and he continued botanizing until the end of his life. Soon after Engelman's death in 1884, Henry Shaw established the Henry Shaw School of Botany at Washington University, St. Louis. In honor of Engelman, he named the dean of the school the George Engelmann Professor of Botany. Dr. William Trelease was named the first dean, and he subsequently became the first director of the garden after Henry Shaw's passing in 1889. Since that time, every successive president or director here at the garden has been named the George Engelmann Professor of Botany in his honor. Engelman's personal herbarium of 100,000 specimens would soon after be donated to the Missouri Botanical Garden and remains one of the most historically important herbarium collections today. The Peter H. Raven Library and Garden Archives is today one of the major botanical collections in the world and currently holds more than 250,000 books, journals, pamphlets, maps, documents, prints, and paintings. The rare book collection holds about 6,500 books, the oldest of which was published in 1474. The garden's library catalog can be viewed at mbglibrary.org. The library also contains a full book conservation lab and digital imaging lab. Today, the Missouri Botanical Garden is a National Historic Landmark and a treasured part of the St. Louis community. We are also a critical partner in plant conservation throughout the world. Our mission is to discover and share knowledge about plants and their environment in order to preserve and enrich life.
Ready.
Thanks for watching today, and be sure to check out the garden online at www.mobot.org.